Bom, gente, prazer ter vocês aqui na escola hoje. Português está bem para todo mundo? Todo mundo aqui português vai? Tá. Então, olha, prazer ter vocês aqui hoje com a gente. Quer dizer, para quem não conhece, o INSPER é uma instituição meio peculiar no Brasil. Nós somos uma instituição privada, sem fins lucrativos, e nossa missão aqui, nosso mandato aqui é prover bens públicos. Colaborar com o debate, a formação, e essa área de cursos de gestão de política pública tem crescido, é uma área de intenso investimento na escola, com o apoio da Fundação Brava, para promover eventos como o de hoje. Certamente nós temos imensos desafios para a política pública no Brasil. A gente assiste aí todo esse momento difícil do país, não necessariamente por falta de recursos, às vezes por falta de gestão, às vezes por falta de foco, muitas vezes por falta de transparência. Esse compromisso com o bem público é a nossa missão. Deixa eu mudar para o inglês aqui. It was our pleasure when we start to inquire abroad about other experience on public schools and schools on public government, to find out the Oxford experience, right? Which is a pretty new experience and very focused on people management as well, right? And has been really a pleasure to learn from them, and I think it's a pleasure for us to have you here today to talk to us and to help us how to guide these discussions on public management and public policy that we so much need in Brazil. So, unfortunately, I'll have another meeting right now, so I have to go. And I leave you. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Such a pleasure to be here.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Great.
Bye-bye, guys.
Lovely. So, I want to start today by talking about the huge inflection point that we're at. So we'll get to what a school can do. But first, I want to define, as it were, what the problem is that we need to face. Because it's quite easy for people to continue life as usual. But across the whole world, democracies are at an extraordinary inflection point. In almost every democracy in the world, including in Brazil, more than 50% of the population are using their vote to vote against the establishment, to vote against established political parties, to vote against established leaders. When we look for Latin America at trust in leaders, or whether people respect leadership, we find that leaders in all sectors are polling lower than ever before, but politicians are polling at about 4%. So this is a very serious moment for us to think about. And what I want to open some comments on today are the three elements that I think we've got to think about as current and future public policy scholars and leaders. And the first is nothing short of a new economic model. The second is a new politics. And the third is a new international cooperation. Because I think we should start with what are the problems that we actually have to solve in an extraordinarily urgent way. It really struck me, the last 3 days I was at the World Economic Forum that was held here in Sao Paulo. And President Temer and Governor Alckmin, Mayor Doria, other politicians were speaking. And I'm looking at a country, and I say this as an outsider, so please bear with me. I'm very ignorant about Brazil. But I'm looking at a country in which I'm told 60% of households are living on less than 2,000 reals a month. So that's 60% of the population. And the polls that I'm reading in Britain are telling me that Bolsonaro actually is gaining a lot of support, much more than people predicted he would. And I'm watching politicians line up, perhaps because it was the World Economic Forum, to say that their number one priority is fiscal balance, and their number 2 priority is to contain inflation. Please, you're welcome, or not, or, you know.
Sorry.
Not at all. And I sit there as the foreigner listening and saying, the 60% of Brazilians that might not have much money do have one thing, which is a vote. And I can't imagine if I were one of those 60% being mobilized to vote by somebody who said that the first priority was fiscal balance and the second was containing inflation. It's, there has to be a better project than that. I want to go through what I think are 3 elements of it that I think we need to rise to. So the first is the economic model that we've all been working on for 30 years. We've had the comfort of knowing that economic growth really is a tide that lifts most people up. And so you get distributional problems, you get poverty, inequality, but a good solution is growth. We're now at a point where suddenly that's changed. What do we know? We know first that the labor share of income is declining. In other words, workers are earning less. 23 out of 25 OECD countries, 50% of people have wages that are stagnating or reducing over the last decade. So workers really are earning less in most countries. And they have very little bargaining power. Because on the one side, there is the outsourcing of their jobs, and on the other are the robots. I like the report the Wall Street Journal did on auto car workers. In Detroit, a car worker earns $50 an hour, 95% unionized. In Shenzhen province, a car worker earns $15 an hour. And in Alabama, in the United States, an auto parts worker earns $8.75 an hour and works in a factory which has 50% more accidents than their northern car workers. That triangle is quite a powerful one for our times, because the highly unionized worker on $50 an hour will most surely be replaced by a robot. The $8.75 an hour worker who's working in a fairly unsafe factory is not living a life that has any dignity or any prospect of improvement or any prospect of their children being decently educated and having health care. So that's an unsustainable outcome. And what about the Chinese? Maybe $15 is an equilibrium, but what does that mean for what our economic model is going to deliver on? So we've got a declining labor share of income, and we've got technology, which means that many jobs will be replaced. Now, people have different estimates of this. Some wildly hysterical that there'll be no jobs left, and some quite modest. But what we do know is that a lot of jobs that exist now will be replaced by technology, and that anxiety is being felt by workers around the world. Adding to that, as we were talking about earlier, the OECD, the Financial Times produced on Monday a report about global taxation, which tells us that across the OECD, personal income tax has increased by 6%, and corporate tax has reduced by 10% on average. So what I just described to you as the economic model, where workers are earning less, they're also being taxed more. And meanwhile, the corporations who are eliciting in Europe a huge counter-reaction because they're seen as avoiding tax, in fact, on average, their tax rates are reducing. So if labor share of income is declining, public policy is making it decline even faster. And if the high-tech and corporate sector's income is increasing, tax policy is making that increase. So the inequality that we're looking at is on a trajectory simply to get worse and worse. And so we need a new economic model. We actually need to rise to the challenge on this. If we complacently sit and say, well, let's just push for growth, or as the politicians I saw lining up, let's just make sure we get fiscal balance and contain inflation. First, they will lose elections, and I'll move to that in a minute. But second, they will not address the most urgent problem of our time. So where should we look to? I don't come to you today with a solution. I come today with the issue, to say this is an issue that's going to need every academic, every policymaker, every private sector CEO, non-governmental to get on board and start thinking about. Yesterday in my conversation with your politicians, they said to me, no, but Ngaire, you don't understand. Fiscal balance and containing inflation are very important for Brazilians because of our economic history. They're very important. That's why they're our priorities. I still don't believe that that's the priority of the 60% who are living on 2,000 reals a day. And why do I say that? And why do I think we've got to think bigger? I reminded them, and I think this is a powerful example, that in 1945, in Britain, you had a government led by Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, a huge hero figure. He'd won the Second World War, and in 1945 he was up for election. And no one around him doubted that he would win the election. He lost the election. He lost the election because he faced a population that were anxious, worried about their housing, their health, their education, their children, and the future. He lost to a man called Clement Attlee, not a charismatic man, not a big character, not a hero, quite an introverted, curious man, actually. But what Clement Attlee had done was gather together a group that he sent to actually live in Britain's slums at the time, on council housing estates, to learn what were the real problems that these people faced. What were the problems that a government had to deliver on? And what they delivered was extraordinary. Let's not forget, this was a Britain. So Brazil's leading policymakers told me that Brazil has too high a debt to think about a transformational plan. Rubbish. Britain in 1945 had a debt 250% of GDP, much higher than Brazil's. Right? And yet, what that group of politicians did was unveil first a national house building program. They said too many Brits are living in slums. They committed to build 200,000 houses a year. Second, with extraordinary ambition, they announced a national health service, that they would create a health service that would be free for every Brit to go to the doctor and to go to the hospital. National health service. And third, that they would commit to building decent schools so that every single child in Britain could go to a decent school. Now they did that at a time when Britain was totally bankrupt. A lot of infrastructure destroyed by the war. And they came up with that bold vision. So my challenge is, what's the bold vision today? If they could do that in those circumstances, what's our bold vision today, and how do we build that bold vision? And I'll come to that. So my first question to you all, or my first challenge, is what should the economic model be? And I'm not convinced of the solutions that are out there. I have colleagues in Britain talking about universal basic income as a solution to this huge technological transition. But it's not just a question of economic distribution, is it? It's a question of human dignity, of identity, of a sense of belonging in a society. And that's again what the post-war British policies looked at. They looked at housing, health, education as issues not just of redistribution, but what it takes as a minimal provision for somebody to feel part of a society and to feel that they belong in that society. And that's a problem not just for Brazil, but for every country in the world. Look at what just happened in Italy in the weekend. More than half of the Italian population voted for parties that don't believe in the system. Everybody said those parties would not win. When I asked President Temer and Governor Armin and Medoria if they were worried about populism in Brazil, they assured me that the polls were wrong. The polls are not capturing things, but nobody's going to vote for Bolsonaro because really it's 40% of they might be right. I'm the foreigner. But all I would share with you is that in America, before Trump's election, people made the same argument to me. They said the polls are wrong because they're only getting this percent or that percent. In Britain, with the Brexit referendum, people said the same to me. They said, yeah, but the polls are wrong because the polling method and this and that, and it's not good. So I'm skeptical. And my point is not about whether Bolsonaro wins or not. That's not for me to adjudicate. It's that every democracy in the world must listen to this clarion call. We have a warning sign. What more does it take than when 50% of our population say there isn't a single establishment political figure that we want to vote for? That's the clarion call. So the first part of our response, I think, has to be a new economic model. The second has to be a new model of politics, and this is equally important. So we can say, everywhere I travel in the world around democracies, people say the populists are terrible, evil populists, and they fulminate about the populists. Well, actually, we have to be much more humble than that and learn from them. What is it that they're doing that is succeeding? How do we build a new model of politics that notices what's working for people? The first thing I think is that establishment politics has lost connection with people and what people really care about. Politicians seem no longer to know. They've relied for 30 years on PR companies, on focus groups, on polls that they themselves run, and they've lost connection with what people really care about. Why do I say that? Even in Brazil, and again, forgive me, I mean, I'm giving Brazilian examples, but you're the ones that know about Brazil. But when I hear Bolsonaro say, give every Brazilian a gun, and I hear people say that's ridiculous, that's not what I think. I think when he says give every Brazilian a gun, there are probably lots of Brazilians that hear him saying, I get it, you're worried about your security. They probably don't agree that the way to solve the problem is by giving everybody a gun. But what they hear is not about giving the gun. It's at least there's one politician that understands that I'm worried, I'm scared, my security's at risk. And that's what I saw in the United States with Trump. That's what I saw in Britain with Brexit. That there was this rational elite saying, oh, but that doesn't make sense, complacently, and not responding to people. So how do we listen? What is a new politics? What's the listening model for new politics? Look at what's worked. So I talked about Attlee sending people to live in slums. But look at what Emmanuel Macron did in France. So before he began his campaign, he did something called La Grande Marche, where he got young people to go door to door. He didn't rely on the computer for this. He had fabulous social media, which is very important. But this was foot soldiers going to houses. They did, I think, 300,000 households. They knocked on the door, and they said to French people of all different parts of wealth, poor, political spectrum, religion, etc. And they asked them, what do you care about? What matters? Where do you think government works? Where do you think it doesn't work? What do you think of politicians? Which ones do you trust? Why? So they actually listened to people in a systematic way, and they wove that into their campaign. So we should notice that. It's astonishing how in democracies, again, across Europe, across this continent, politicians are continuing their campaigns as if they don't need to learn that lesson. So lesson one from the success of the populists, as well as the success of people like Macron, is you have to be listening and responding to the concerns of the electorate. We need to reconnect that part of the electorate. Lesson two. Lesson two for me is to rethink. Some of you might have read Oakeshott, the famous political theorist, who tells us about politics, about two forms of politics, the politics of pragmatism and the politics of transformation. And the politics of pragmatism has been the politics of the last 30 years. That's the politics that probably we all do in this room, right? How do we increase GDP by 1%? What's the incremental efficiency gain we can have by using this way of doing public management? It's deliverology, it's increasing the efficiency of government, and it's promising that to the electorate. But the other politics, which has always been there, go back to Thucydides and read about politics in ancient Greece, it's always been there, is the politics of transformation, redemption, salvation. The politicians that present themselves sometimes using literally evangelical language, but promising a transformation. Because it's that politics that mobilizes people. It's the politics we're watching populists use to perfection. Look at the rallies of populists in all parts of Europe and all parts of the Americas. People coming into that rally to be entertained, but literally being fed with adrenaline, being fed with a transformative vision. So where is the transformative vision in our central, as it were, centrist politics? Where is it in the establishment? It's not there. I had quite a lot of fun over the last 3 days asking politicians from this country, what do you love about Brazil? Like, what do you think, what has Brazil got that will make it really successful? And a lot of them just looked at me, puzzled, and then repeated all the problems that Brazil has. And I thought, well, if you don't believe in us, as it were, then why should we believe in you? You know, like, ask yourself that question. If you really want people to trust you to lead them to something better, you've got to believe in them, right? You've got to have thought about what it is that they've got that will help a country become better. So I think that's the second lesson from the populists. When Trump says, make America great, intellectuals around the world pour scorn and say he doesn't have a clue. Like, what does that mean? But it's a rallying message. What we should be asking ourselves is, why are other politicians not presenting a positive vision of what could be? Because isn't that what you have leaders for in the first place? So I think that. And then the third thing I think we need to learn from populists, and this is a really important one, is about simplicity. Simple does not mean simplistic. I think a lot of academics, a lot of professional public policy people think that there is a world of complex public policy ideas which the public will always be too stupid to understand. And the populists have got simplistic messages which prey on that stupidity. I think that's profoundly wrong. People are smart. They might not have a formal education, but they're smart. And as public policy scholars, as public policy leaders, it's for us to work out, to take the time, to make the effort, to take complex ideas and make them simple and intuitively understandable. Because if we don't do that, we're disrespecting the people we want to serve, and we're not permitting them to hold us to account, right? If we're not telling them what we're doing and why we're doing it, they cannot hold us to account. A simple example, my friend Andrés Velasco, when he was Minister of Finance in Chile, and they wanted to create, so Chile has lots of copper. Copper prices had gone up. The country was now going to be wealthy because copper prices had gone up. They produce a lot of copper. So people were very excited. Suddenly Chile might become wealthy. So he's the finance minister, and what he wants to do is create a posterity fund, to create a special fund for Chile to invest later on. So what do you say to a population? The academics in the Blavatnik school, among Andrés' friends, have a beautiful slide deck that shows all the economics of windfall gains and revenues and smoothing and investment, and right. But as Andrés put it, he quite quickly realized that in the 5 seconds or 10 seconds he had on morning television between a cookery class and a yoga class, there wasn't much point producing graphs about the smoothing of windfall gains, right? You had to have a simple, intuitive message, and it took time to produce it. And the simple message was, as you all know, well, the English expression is, you must save for a rainy day, right? That things can go wrong, your roof might need replacing. In Britain we talk about saving so that you can replace the roof on your house for when it rains, okay? So it's finding a form that people understand intuitively to explain what you're doing. And I think instead of doing that, public policy scholars, political leaders, have simply ignored the need to do that and come up with simplistic messages. And so rather than look at the populists and say they're simplistic, give everybody a gun is simplistic, think about how intuitively appealing is your alternative to that. Is it speaking to the concern And how simple and intuitive have you made it? So to me, that's the reformulation of politics. And then finally, my first challenge to you is, what kind of new economic model do we need? And the second challenge is, what kind of new politics do we need? And the third challenge is, how will this country and others step up and create a new form of international cooperation? Because there we're on a complete inflection point. The United States, don't forget, under President Obama, after the Iraq War, was already declining in international influence. But President Trump has most surely accelerated that. And he's accelerated it because most countries, whether they agree or disagree with his various policy twists and turns, now know one thing for sure, which is you don't know what they're going to do. Right? And that unpredictability is very difficult for a country that other countries have relied upon to be the stable hegemon in the system. So 3 examples of them stepping back: the nuclear posture review, which they announced in February. For the first time, the United States has announced, or this administration have announced, that they will think about using nuclear retaliation for non-nuclear threats. That drives that smashes 40 years of non-proliferation negotiations right there. On the eve of his trip to Latin America, the former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, announced that he thought the Monroe Doctrine was a good idea, ripping up a decade of quite careful diplomacy to reconstruct a different relationship with this continent. At Davos, the Secretary of the Treasury, Mnuchin, casually reflected that it would be good for America's trade balance if the dollar were weaker, ripping up 40 years of rule-based exchange rate policy, and ignoring the fact that the United States relies upon demand for dollars in order to keep spending and running a huge deficit. So actually what he was proposing is not feasible for a country that's running a huge deficit and relies on other countries and investors believing in a strong dollar. So these put shockwaves through the system. But then, so that's the United States pulling back from its hegemonic role and other countries losing faith in it. So if you look at the global surveys, international trust in the United States leadership has plummeted. So we've seen a marked drop in the last 18 months in other countries' trust. And on the other side of the coin, on the positive side, and this makes me optimistic about international cooperation, is what's happening when the United States withdraws. So think about TPP. When the United States administration withdrew, they assumed it would collapse TPP. It was quite shocking for many when the 11 remaining countries announced that they're going ahead without the United States. Think about the Paris climate negotiations process. When President Trump announced that the United States was withdrawing, they genuinely believed that that would take the oxygen out of the process. And what's happened since? Every single country in the world has joined it. Every single country in the world is now a participant in the Paris climate change negotiations. And the United States is the only country in the world that's not. This is dramatic. When the United States told its allies not to join China's new multilateral development bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, they all did the opposite. 84 countries have joined the AIIB. Personally, I don't think we would have seen this 10 years ago. The United States leadership role was still robust at the center of the system, and countries would have thought twice. So what we have now is an opportunity for this country, for European countries, for other countries in the world to really think about how you want to shape international cooperation and to start thinking about what's the coalition you're going to work with. How are you going to use regional cooperation? How are you going to use international cooperation around specific issues? And we've seen examples. Brazil played a huge role in the formation of the BRICS Bank that now sits in Shanghai, the new development bank. So Brazil has formed on thinking about this, but now that thinking is going to have to go further. And just as an occasional visitor to this country, it feels as though there's almost less talking about Brazil's role globally now than there was, particularly during Cardoso and then the first Lula administration. There was a lot of talk in Brazil about Brazil and the rest of the world. It just feels not on the agenda at the moment, but I think that that's quite an important one to be on the agenda. So that's the third challenge. It's what will countries like Brazil do to forge a new kind of international cooperation. So that's what I wanted to say as an introduction. And I thought in questions we can talk about the role of schools, like this one, like the one in Oxford, in rising to that challenge. But I'd love to hear your questions and comments or disagreements from here. So, questions?
Yeah. There is a feeling, like, in the last mayor election of São Paulo, the current mayor promised that he was more of a manager and not a politician.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it seems nowadays that people are preferring to elect managers instead of politicians. What is happening? Because if you are a politician, you should be an agent for transformation. Now, why are people tired of electing politics and saying that, I'm a manager, I'm a president of a corporation? What is happening there?
So there's so many parts to that which are about trust in what kind of vision that politicians actually have. And people around the world say three things about politicians. It's not just in Brazil, it's everywhere in the world. First two things they say is they're in it for themselves. They don't have a public vision. They have really what they're pursuing is their own self-interested goals. They're corrupt and they're incompetent, right? And different countries weigh those differently, but whether I'm in China or Nigeria or Britain or Italy or Brazil or Mexico, people say the same thing to me. They say politicians are those three things, right? Self-interested narcissists, corrupt, incompetent. So we have to think, we were talking before this session about how we train ourselves, how we train our students, how we train current leaders to get beyond that and to build trust in what they actually do. And one of the first things is how you build the vision. So when I think the public vote managers, partly because politicians don't dare to have a vision to let them vote on, and which is partly because they don't know how to build that vision. But in the French election, the French electors were not interested in the managerial candidates. In the Italian election, that was Renzi's big issue. I will manage this well. Total collapse in the polls. So to me, it goes a little bit to what I'm saying about how politicians build a vision and then how they express that vision. We also, we were talking before we came about what schools need to do, and I was saying that in my view, there's been too little attention in schools of management and schools of public policy to the principled reasons for decision. Because if you just make decisions with no principled reasons behind them, then why would the public not think that you were just making self-interested decisions? So it's pretty important for all people to learn in the public sector that they have to give reasons, that they must learn on what principled basis they're making decisions, even the most small decisions, because those decisions give the public a chance to hold them to account for the bases on which these decisions are being made. So I think it's quite a, don't get me wrong, I can think of at least one country in the world where there's a leader committed to getting rid of corruption. But getting rid of corruption, that example shows us, is not enough. You have to build integrity and build effective government. Because in some cases, a politician who gets rid of corruption but is incompetent leads the population to believe, actually, we'd rather have a bit of corruption but some competence. So you don't want to end up there. Right? You have to build both integrity and competence. Yeah.
Thank you for this terrific lecture, Professor Woods. So my question would be on the role of a public management or a public policy school, because I think a lot about having a huge or the maximum impact on some individuals that come here, and we can provide like courses and education and lecture opportunities, or trying to have some effect on a larger number of people and in society in general. I don't know if it's always a question of either or, but as we discussed earlier today, we are terribly sad this week with the shooting and murder of Councilwoman Marielle in Rio de Janeiro. And this was someone who had succeeded. Like, she did everything right, and she got there. She was an emerging leader. And so the maximum impact that this one individual could have on society was brutally interrupted. So how can we deal with like these choices as a school, like on having impact on individuals and also on society in general?
Yeah. And the loss from that shooting is incalculable for Brazil, and you know you've just got to you've got to hope that others are going to follow in her footsteps, and that people in this room can help people understand how they can do that. Sadly, tragedies do not result in change. When people read terrible news, there's some pretty good psychological evidence about this. When you read that something terrible's happened, that orphans are being slaughtered, that the human reaction is to go, that's terrible. It's so terrible that I'm going to have another cup of coffee and then go to work, right? That if we want to catalyze change, you have to tell human beings how. You've got to tell them 20 orphans are being slaughtered. But here is a young woman who has made a difference by doing the following, which tells the reader, I too could do that, and mobilizes action. So maybe even at this moment, the call for what kind of action people can take is a really important one. But what can schools, so does it make a difference? So my own view, which is why I've spent my whole life thinking about how to make government work better, is that it's the one place where a very small improvement in government can affect millions of lives. So we shouldn't be put off just because we can't make government perfect. We shouldn't be put off by the fact that government's incredibly difficult, that you can't fix everything, that sometimes you can only fix one little thing. Because by fixing one little thing, you can actually benefit hundreds of thousands of people. So it's worth it. And the other thing I would say is that one person in government, or two good people in government, or even a cluster of 6 people, but we're still in a smaller number that fit in this classroom, can make that kind of difference. Right? That even in the most difficult political systems, I think of alumni of the Blavatnik school who have gone back to Yemen, or Afghanistan, or Libya, countries which make Brazil look like a perfect system for change, right? And they've achieved things. They've built little islands of policy that work. They've made a difference. So we have to start with that recognition that very small numbers of people working together can make a huge difference in government. And they can do it by creating a little island which attracts the best people to it to make change. And so I think we can do that as a school. Was that your question? Yeah.
So I wonder, for people that are getting involved in public policy, so schools you have a kind of self-selection bias. People that enroll normally, they are idealists and they're activists, but oftentimes there's an expense of pragmatism. So I'm a halfway, so I'm a strategic management professor, but also a public management professor, so can be both sides of the fence.
Yep.
On the other side, in the management, you have the excess pragmatism. And the example you gave about Yemen, it seems that you have a flame or an activist. However, they were pragmatic. Given they look at the boundary conditions, and under those, they could find something.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know how you can achieve this balance in Blavatnik, because both sides are important. The flame of activism is really important, the passion. However, we need to calculate. We need to do cost-benefit analysis. We need to understand the constraints, the boundary conditions. How you achieve such a balance over there?
it's got to be a balance, right? There's no point having some huge idealistic goal which pays no attention to how it can be implemented. But for me, leadership is I don't like the word leadership very much because of what it means in so many places. But humans do need leadership because any group of human beings needs clearly to elaborate its goal and mobilize towards it. And usually a good leader helps with that, right? They help a group identify the goal and mobilize towards it. But those two things are really interconnected because you can't have vision on one side, the activist, and pragmatism on the other, the managerial position. Neither alone will achieve anything.
Yeah.
You can go perfectly pragmatically in circles, right? You can keep a country in perfect fiscal balance for decades and it will go nowhere without some greater vision. You can have some extraordinary vision that will go absolutely nowhere unless you've got the means. But to me, the challenge in public policy is how you knit those together, how you create goals which actually pay attention to what's possible. My own solution to that is not the only way to do that is to work with the people who are going to implement and to unleash their ability to come up with solutions as well. So it's to get the pragmatic management professor to think about to what end a little bit more. And it's to get the activist professor who's got this golden goal to think much more about how, who. Who are the people that are going to make that happen? What do those people want to do? What are they good at? How do you mobilize to that goal? It's the same in the private sector, actually. This combination of needing to know what you're trying to achieve and then how to achieve it. But does that answer?
No, I totally agree with the balance. I would like to know how you do this in Blavatnik. How you can, is a matter of training professors and then selecting professor is just evolves.
So I think it's that I would never claim that we're getting anything right at the Blavatnik school, but what I observe is that most of the professors in the school are working with governments or with real life problems. And once you start trying to help somebody solve a problem, you become much more pragmatic. It actually slightly changes what you focus on, because you become aware that the obstacle might not be that people have doubts about the regression analysis. The obstacle might be, that the Constitution is not allowed to do it, or the obstacle might be that they don't have the motivation to do it because they don't understand the goal. In other words, I think that's what we can do as scholars. As scholars, we need to get closer up to the problems, not because we should be civil servants producing solutions to day-by-day problems. No. I mean, I see the world like a clock where the civil servants, public officials, are on the second hand of the clock, and the think tanks are on the minute hand. They're asking questions a little bit, and as scholars, we're on the hour hand of the clock. But just because we're on the hour hand of the clock, we shouldn't detach ourselves from what the problem is. We might be looking for deeper, more rigorous, longer-term solutions. But there have got to be solutions. It cannot be a self-indulgent academic debate about whether footnote 32 of a theory that was produced 30 years ago was right or wrong, right? I mean, we can do better than that. Questions? Yes. Okay, Caroline.
So my question is, how do we reach these people that are far away from the university, for example? What's our role as university students and as a university? We know there's a lot of good people working in the government, and many times they're not motivated or they feel alone. So as a university, how we create these networks and we guarantee that they can reach us and then we can empower them to do the change in their governments.
So I think it's a great question. And I would start by thinking about, what is it that we have access to that they perhaps don't have access to? So to me, first it's when you're really busy at the coalface in public office trying to solve a problem, the problem looks unique because in your day-to-day life it is unique, right? You're trying to solve a security problem in a specific favela, right? It's all unique. The people are unique. The situation, the moment is unique. But as a scholar sitting here in INSPED, you've got access to data about very similar security problems along the border of Colombia, in Mexico, in Afghanistan, in other places. You've got some great data. I know there are scholars in the school that work on this about the impact of a military intervention, about what happens if you kill the leader of a gang or a terrorist group or a parastatal group, about what kinds of solutions work and what kinds of solutions don't. So what you can do, which I think is really helpful to people, is take that information to them in a digestible form and say, hey, yes, this is a unique situation, but here's what we know from other situations. It's like I was saying before, my own little rule is try and make original mistakes in public policy. Don't keep making the same mistakes that every other country and every other community has made. Like, learn from those. And a university, what is a university? A university is a place of knowledge. But there's no point being a place of knowledge if it's just to indulge ourselves, right? We're a place of knowledge for society. We must serve our societies by making that knowledge available to them when they need it. Knowledge about who the society is, where it's going, not just how to solve problems, but across the whole piece. So I think that's what you can do. You can take specific problems, find out what the evidence tells us from other countries, from other communities, and take that and share it with them. Not by going in and saying, I am the brilliant scholar from Oxford University, I have the solution to your problem. No, obviously not. But just by saying, look, you have this problem, obviously you will know what solutions are going to work best, but you might want to know that here's what these other communities have done, and here's what their experience has been.
First of all, thank you very much for a very enlightening lecture. I'd like to do a question about your first new economic model. I think it's, I totally agree with you, but now, right now we have a worldwide speech that's proposing social rights against economy. Like the same thing we had in Europe, like Greece and Spain, when we say that we have to contain the public spenders on social rights, on housing, on health systems, and we have the same speech we had here in Brazil, like last year, where you put a constitutional amendment that throws the spenders on social rights and on social policies in general for the next 10 years. And we have a very speech of fear that we are actually going to have a very bad economic movement and that things are going to stay as they are right now if we don't stop spending. So I'd like to think about the path, about the way or tools for changing that.
I think understanding where that fear of public spending comes from is really important. Because during the 1950s and 60s, Brazil, Europe, most countries around the world had 2 decades of quite well managed public expenditure. But then things began to change at the end of the 1960s. It began with the deregulation of the dollar, sort of globalization of the dollar, and then picked up when oil prices increased in the 1970s, and suddenly there was huge liquidity. There was a lot of money in the system, and big banks were suddenly allowed to lend to sovereigns abroad with no reserve requirements. So if you were a big American bank, any lending you did within the United States, you had to keep a percentage of what you were lending. That was your reserve ratio, cardinal rule of banking. But guess what? International regulation did not keep up with the globalization of activity. So they could lend to the government of Brazil without keeping any reserve at all. They could lend as much as they want to the government of Brazil, and they did. And interest rates at the time were negative. So why were interest rates negative? I mean, when you think about a negative interest rate means that a bank would come to the government of Brazil and say, borrow money from us and we'll pay you for lending from us. So obviously they weren't doing it quite like that. So what made interest rates negative? Okay, inflation, right? When inflation outpaces your interest rate, your real interest rate is negative. So in the 1970s, interest rates were negative too. I've never met a government that when offered the chance to borrow millions of dollars and be paid for borrowing it does not take that offer. It was toxic. So in the 1970s, we saw a huge expansion in public debt and incredibly bad public spending, right? Where it fueled corruption and, frankly, big windfall gains for governments almost always fuel massive corruption and end badly. What is the saying? That governments have the habit of treating windfall positive gains as permanent and windfall negative shocks as temporary. This is a disequilibrium, right? So you saw countries across this continent, but across other continents in the 1970s borrow huge amounts of money, and a lot of it ended up in the Swiss bank accounts of the leaders of the time, or spent on huge white elephant projects, huge public infrastructure projects that were corrupt, poorly conceived, unnecessary. And so in 1979, when Paul Volcker became Federal Reserve Chairman and wanted to stop inflation, he put up interest rates very suddenly. It meant that Brazil, which had been borrowing at -2, suddenly faced, as its debt contracts rolled over, 13% interest, which is why you had a debt crisis. That's why in 83, 84, Brazil was threatening to default on its debt, right? But the political change was huge when Mrs. Thatcher came to power in Britain and Ronald Reagan came to power in the United States. It was after a decade of really bad government spending. And so they committed themselves to a smaller state and the idea that government spending is bad. It's only the private sector that should spend. It's not the public sector. And I think we have to remember that history, both parts of it. The 1950s taught us that public spending can be a good thing. The 1970s taught us that it can be a terrible thing. In my view, the 1990s taught us that public-private partnerships can be either very good or very bad. You can either, when you get public-private partnerships, whether it's privatization or outsourcing by government, what you're trying to do is get the best of the public sector, the best of the private sector. All the nimble, consumer-focused responsiveness of the private sector with all the public interest and long-termism of the public sector. Sadly, lots of the public-private partnerships, certainly in Britain, of the 1990s, got the worst of both sectors. All the opportunistic, squeezing profit out of contracts rather than delivery of the private sector, and all the slowness and bureaucratic, bad procurement procedures, etc., of the public sector. So you got the worst of both. It doesn't have to be the worst of both, right? So I think that's a challenge ahead of us, is how to get the private sector and public sector working together brilliantly, right? Which I think you can try to harness the best of both sectors. So public expenditure has a history, but we need to remember both bits, and we're all scholars, so we can remind people of both bits. I do think history is really important for public policy and public management, because it teaches us so much, and yet it's often the thing that gets dropped from the curriculum, but it's really, really powerful. You know, I was being asked about Facebook and Google and the role of Facebook in pandering hate speech. You know, Folia has just pulled out of Facebook, right, because of their curation of information. And there's a wonderful example in British political history of pamphleteering, where once you had a printing press, politicians would, and people pushing causes, would use the printers to print pamphlets which said terrible things, hate speech, defamatory lies, etc., and created huge conflict in society. And that got regulated, and they regulated it by requiring the printers to always have the name and address of the person for whom they were printing the pamphlet. That's more than a couple of hundred years ago. So with Facebook, for me, it's really simple. They're publishing material, just like the printing press was publishing material. They have to take responsibility for what they publish. They're a publisher. They are not a platform. They keep saying they're a platform. In law school, I learned that publication is making material available to more than 3 people. They're certainly doing that. And they're curating the material using algorithms and such like. They are publishers. They need to be regulated as such. But it's history. I just think we can always look back, even for this seemingly totally modern problem, we need to look back in history and think, is this the first time we've had this problem? And how has it been sorted before? Sorry, I'll try and be much shorter in my answers, taking you down a lead. Yeah.
You were talking before about the communication and how politics should be more, try to get closer to people. She mentioned something. And I feel there's a problem of timing in that issue. People in Brazil and many other countries, the needs that if you go to each household and ask, the needs you see, you find are needs that are very deep needs. Needs that answers probably take time to actually change or try to bring some benefit to it. And governments, if you have a politician, you get to the government who have 4 years, 5 years, depending on the system. And you don't really do that kind of deep change in 4 years, 5 years. And some things are, and they are not simple, or sometimes they're complex. So I just wanted to hear from you, how do you see the things that are like not simple?
Yeah.
And how can we make it simple and make this dialogue if it is complex and not being simplistic? And I don't know if I made myself understood.
Crystal clear. Because part of the problem that you're addressing is how do we get politicians to demand good solutions? How do we, in other words, as an alternative to the, I'm going to send in the guns, right? Like, simple, easy, commanding, right? How do we get politicians to want and use solutions that are more careful or evidence-based? And I think what you work with is what every politician, no matter where they are in the world, wants, has in common with each other, which is a desire to communicate effectively, preferably to public applause, right? They want the support, at least of their voters, right? So when we have political leaders in the school, one of the things that we work with them on is communication and how they communicate. I was working with some Brazilian candidates this morning and just thinking about what good political communication looks like is a driver to better policy. And let me just explain that. So good political communication to build trust has a very simple structure, in my view. The first, I was presenting to them as sentences. So you're speaking to an audience. Your first sentence is, this is it in politics, so they were working through, you're speaking to people from a city which is very unsafe, has lots of guns, people are dying, and the people of the city are demanding security. So what was their speech? So item 1 for me is to frame what your audience's problem is. And that's where politicians are failing. So if you're speaking to Brazilians and 60% of them are on that income bracket, it's to start by saying, I know you're worried, you're scared, you're anxious, your children are being killed in the streets. So that's step 1. Politicians get that, but surprisingly they need to be reminded of that. Look at how many politicians do not do that. They just walk in and start talking about whatever, right? Without demonstrating that they have listened to the population they're speaking to. So that's step 1. Step 2, and this politicians find hard, but it's really, really important for us in forging solutions, is for the politician to say, I can't solve this problem today, right? I can't solve it immediately. It's to put the short-term thing down. It's to say, I would love to tell you all that by tomorrow the streets will be safe, but I cannot do that. That's a trust-building move. And you've got to trust that people are intelligent enough to understand that. They're sick of politicians saying, I'll solve your problems overnight, and then not doing it. So step 2 is a trust building. Step 3 is, having said I can't do it overnight, but here is what we will do. Here is my plan. Starting on Monday, we'll do X. In 6 months' time, you will be able to see if we've done Y. And after 1 year, you'll see if we've done Z. if we can get politicians to buy into this, they then need a plan, right? Suddenly they realize that if they're going to go and make a speech, they need a plan. And usually they don't have a plan. And usually they haven't thought of asking their civil servants for a plan. Nor have they come to INSPER and said, would you help us forge this plan? So you have to work with their desire to communicate, to get a demand for the plan, and then put the plan in. And then step 4 for me is where you want to get to. And if we do this plan, so here is what we're going to do, and if we do this, in 5 years' time, the streets of this favela really will be safe, or the streets of this city really will be safe. But it's going to take 5 years. But it's to say the prognosis is positive, but it's just going to take that long. So I think it's working with, I mean, I know what I've just said, it sounds totally simple and simplistic and not at all scholarly, but what I have observed is that there is almost never an operational plan. And if you don't have an operational plan, it's always the populist solution that will win. You can't go to a town meeting and have somebody stand up and say, well, I'm going to give everybody in this city a gun. And then you stand up and you say, well, the problems are more complicated, and I have 51 questions about that policy, and really it's going to take a very long time. I mean, you think about it. If you're feeling unsafe, somebody's got a concrete suggestion, which might be bonkers, and you've got no suggestion. So, it's not going to end well. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. And I have a question going back to one of the things that you started your presentation talking about the time of Winston Churchill. And then you came along and you said something responding to, I think, to Caroline, question about historical aspects that we have to look at them. But it would lead me, and as I'm trying to play devil's advocate, we see a lot of this change, and what happened in England in the 45s is a time of rupture, huge rupture, and then you have to start from zero, to start from a point that is like, well, there's nothing there, where there's a lot of change, right? And I was wondering if actually some of the change that we are proposing, there should be a lot of rupture. And if it's rupture, how do you call rupture or promote a rupture that is not destructive, but is constructive in the sense of like, well, what do we do with that? And how do you promote this moment that is like, it's enough, let's do something else. And that is not, like, I'm not calling for revolution, I'm calling for something that can be constructive. And at the same time, avoid historical determinism, in the sense of like, oh, we are girls of that we cannot move without these things happening by itself, of course, without any action.
So, and there is a view in Europe that what we all need is a good world war to reset.
Yes.
And I'm profoundly unsympathetic to this view. It might surprise you to know. There's a kind of private sector, Silicon Valley, move fast, break things, disruption. It's great to. I remember being in one of the, I've forgotten which one of the North African countries that had gone through like 3 revolutions in a very short space of time, and listening in astonishment to someone from Silicon Valley saying, well, what you want is disruption, to an audience that were like, God help us, that's the one thing we've got in spades and we don't want more of it. So there's a sort of curious kind of sense of what this, usually people who speak positively about disruption live in very, very, very sedate places, right? It seems like a really positive thing. I remember when I first got to Oxford as a student, someone made a different form of the same argument to Amartya Sen and said, yes, but Professor Sen, you just have to break eggs to make an omelette, right? And he looked at them and he said, what I dislike about that argument is it makes me feel an unreasonable sympathy for the eggs. That was a great answer. Okay. And I don't actually believe, you see, I would buy the argument. I certainly agree that you shouldn't waste a crisis. Crises can be moments for change, although not for big bang change, because then you're just adding crisis upon crisis. But it's different to say we need a crisis in order to provoke change, because we haven't actually given an alternative a chance at the moment. It's not as if there's some transformative vision that is failing. In all of our societies, there's nobody offering a transformative vision. So before we say we need another world war to change things, I mean, okay, sorry. There are radicals on the far left and far right that perhaps have a very radical vision of change. But across the center of the political spectrum, I think we're living with a habit of complacency, of 30 years of believing that incremental change, that, you know, that we can use the same tools and the same way of thinking to just keep moving forwards. We don't have to really rethink the relationship of government to citizens. We do not have to rethink how government delivers. We do not have to rethink inequality. Those are three huge gaps that have emerged, and yet I think we haven't rethought those properly. So before we argue that we need another world war to change things, I think we should come up with a plan for change and see if we can make it work. You know, when we've done that and it hasn't worked, we'll go to disruption. Yeah, Bruno.
Professor, I'd like to have your opinion on an understanding. So some of our friends during the MPP, they came from places, from countries where the population has no faith and has no confidence in the government. So government's like an alien or something like this. I wouldn't say that we have the same in Brazil, but we, possibly because of our culture or possibly because of our constitution, which is full of rights and not as many duties that the population needs to fulfill. So it's more a protected thing. And we definitely don't have the feeling that, like quoting JFK, what you have to, not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. We don't have that kind of feeling here. So bringing some of the questions that the colleagues here did, so how do we approach students or new public officers to act or to try to develop a way of working in the government and also communicating with the population in a way that the government is not capable of doing everything. And the population has to do her share because people want more services, they want more stuff, they want more better quality, and at the same time they don't want to pay more for the government to do those things. So the numbers don't match. So what can we do?
It's a big question. So constitutions each emerge in a very particular historical moment, don't they?
Yeah.
And so this constitution emerged. You know, what's astonishing as a foreigner looking at Brazil is how hard the population of Brazil fought for their democracy, right? It's pretty extraordinary. It's an extraordinary, very recent political history of a people that really fought for liberty and democracy across from left to right on the political spectrum. So this is a country who's, you know, that has an appreciation of which kind of rights in democracy matter. And now you're saying, but so it's understandable that constitution is all about the rights of the citizens in respect of an authoritarian government. It had to be at that moment. And now, of course, you're moving into a new generation that weren't part of that fight for democracy, that are therefore much more easily seduced, if we use the European example, by arguments of populists, because the Germans that voted for ADF, the Italians that are voting for the far-right parties, the French who are voting for the National Front, they don't remember what it was like to have a government that was not under the rule of law, but was simply using the law to coerce citizens. They don't remember that. So we've got to remember that too, and relive, you know, or remind, or create the circumstances for the next generation to learn why that's important and to fight for it as well. So I know it's a slightly philosophical way of answering the question, but each generation, you can't pass political values down, right? I just can't stand here and lecture, like, here is what you guys should believe, here is why, you know, human beings should fight for these rights. I believe that John Stuart Mill had it right when he said that people have to fight for their own rights, to understand the meaning of those rights, and to be prepared to defend them in a crisis. So for a school like this, I think we should ask ourselves, are we preparing our students for that? Like, are we imbuing them with an opportunity to think about why that matters and why their contribution matters? And I think there's a risk that public policy schools are too technocratic and they don't, human beings can do good things in a pragmatic, habitual way. But what human beings can do when they're driven by a mission is amazing, right? It's astonishing. It takes us beyond what individuals think that they can do. I always think a very simple example, human bodies haven't changed very much, right? But on one sunny morning in Oxford, a man called Bannister ran the mile in under 4 minutes. First human being ever to do that. And then suddenly, a whole lot of people ran the mile in under 4 minutes. And it wasn't because their bodies changed. It wasn't because running shoe technology changed. It was just because mentally, they thought it was possible. The minute one human being did it, it was like, oh, that is possible. And their mentality changed. That's quite important. Yes.
First of all, thank you for the lecture. And I think we mentioned a lot of comments on technology, but rather negative aspects of it. Facebook not controlling the information it publishes, and on technology reducing the amount of jobs. Do you think there's an upside on technology for this inflection point we're at?
Oh, hugely. I really think there is. So if you look at the 3 gaps I talked about, the gap between government and citizens, technology can play between the political system and citizens. We're already seeing in Brazil and in other countries, in Argentina, where technology can help people mobilize, can help people inform themselves, can help people form communities. We're seeing that it's much more effective if you combine in-person with technology, not all on the web, but combining the two. But that's the first way. It's a way for citizens to join together and to mobilize and to act collectively. So that's huge. What we need to be careful is where it's doing the opposite, where it's creating hate, distrust, and fear, which is why I would regulate the platforms as publishers. A second one is the gap between what citizens demand and what governments can supply, which several of you have mentioned. Citizens want more and more. What's available, for example, in health, the number of treatments and drugs that are available to human beings is huge and far outpaces the possibilities of the public or the private sector to pay for every individual to have them, whether it's through insurance or through the public sector. So how do we start bridging that gap? Well, it's very clear that big data can help us personalize, can help us be much more accurate and precise in what kinds of treatments that we're giving to people, and that can have huge cost savings and huge benefits to expanding the access of people to healthcare. At the same time, so there's a huge promise there, but on big data, we've really got to start thinking about this because we've got 3 models at the moment. There's one model which is the government asserts control over big data. China, for example, where suddenly, in 2 years as the economy in China's gone cashless, it's possible for the government to know what each citizen is reading, what time they ordered their coffee, what bus they took to work, who they're meeting with, which books they've ordered on Amazon. And most people that have lived and been brought up in democracies are uncomfortable with that idea. But then there's the American model, which is the private sector asserts rights to data, right? Apple, Facebook, you've given them this data and they're asserting rights to it, which certainly in Europe, people are very uncomfortable with. They're like, hold on, they're not paying us for that data. They're not even disclosing to us the value of it and their uses of it, right? So that, I don't think is very satisfactory either. And then you've got the European Union that's trying to create a legal framework for citizens to assert their own rights over their own data, which is a third path. It's a nightmare, by the way, as a university. We're not allowed to use your address to send you your results when you've done your degree, unless we have your permission to use your address to send you the results. So some of us, but philosophically, I think they're right. It is citizens that should own their own data, but getting to there is going to be difficult. And then thirdly, I think technology, I talked about technology and the threat to jobs, but look at the upside of an unequal world where people rail a lot in Europe about Amazon because it's not paying taxes where it's earning revenues. It's not, frankly, it needs to update its license to operate, right? It's got to contribute to societies in which it's making huge revenues. However, on the positive side, these platforms for global selling are offering, if you look at the Chinese examples of Alibaba and Tencent and so forth, suddenly small rural companies, producers, entrepreneurs can sell to a global market, right, across platforms. That's pretty astonishing. That's the opposite direction from increasing inequality. That's opening up these global markets to even the one-person operation somewhere quite rural. So to me, technology, I'm enthusiastic about the ways that we can use technology to help solve these gaps, but cognizant that we've got to work out a set of rights and duties and redefine liberty in an era of technology. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
Thank you for your lecture. And I would like to hear a little bit about the connection, because we are discussing about the gap that there is between the population and the politicians. So I would like to hear a little bit about the gap that we have between the scientific community or people that are producing the knowledge and the government, because we have many decisions, especially in Brazil, that is something that I'm more in touch, that they don't care about the evidence that we have already, and they take the decisions, and it's totally separated.
Right. Well, it's probably different in Brazil, but in Britain, what I observe about the relationship between academics and politicians or government officials is that it can be a little bit of a dialogue of the deaf, because the academic goes in knowing that they've spent 25 years of their life working on this question and they've got this research. So they want to share their research with the government official. So it might be the Minister of Health trying to reduce premature mortality, and the scholar has been working on tobacco controls for 25 years. So they want to explain to the British Minister of Health that you've just got to stop Chinese people smoking. Right? That's what the evidence says. But of course, the Minister of Health is sitting there thinking, hold on, I've got to take a position on legislation tomorrow. I've only got 6 hours. And I don't have an hour to spend listening to this academic explaining their life work to me, because it's not helping me make my decision. Right? Or the exchange goes like this, and I've sat in on so many meetings like this, I can't tell you. The policymaker is sitting there and says, look, we're thinking of giving everybody a gun tomorrow to solve the security problem in the country. So what do you think of that? So pretty much every academic in the world, including me, answers that, wanting to say, oh, Minister, the first thing we say is the world is much more complicated than you think, right? And we can go on for a few hours about how complicated the world is, and there's all these effects and counter effects, and we don't have the data, and da-da-da-da, right? So the first hour is the world is more complicated than you think. The second hour is, and the question you're asking is the wrong question, by the way. The question you're asking is the wrong question, because the right question is the one I happen to have been doing research on for 25 years. So let me tell you about that, right? So you're asking the wrong question. And the third point, I'm caricaturing a little, third point that academics make is, and if you insist on asking that question, even though I've explained that it's the wrong question, and you want me to answer it, then I'm going to need like $1 million worth of funding in 10 years so that I can do the research to give you an answer to that question, by which time, of course, you'll be out of government, right? So it's not. So it's a little bit of a dialogue with the deaf. And I think, as academics, we have to own up to that. I mean, look, first time I was ever asked to go and speak to a finance minister, poor chap. There I was, I've been working on all this stuff on IMF reform. So I go in and I'm like, this is my chance, I'm going to just persuade this minister that this is the reform that he should take forward and blah, 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 blah. Of course, the poor minister's sitting there. It's got nothing to do with the decision he's got to make, right? It's so bad. And I sort of thought, well, he's not quite as interested in this as I had hoped, right? And from that encounter was, before we speak to politicians, we should ask ourselves, as any decent man, we can then say, why, when I have been studying this for 20 years and I'm prepared to go and talk to them for free, why on earth are they hiring that management consultant and paying them £100,000 to go and give them advice on what I know about, right? I hear that a lot. And the reason's this, because even not very good management consultants know that the first thing to ask is, what's the decision this person has to make? So they ask themselves that. So when you want to go and speak to a policymaker, you would ask yourself, what's the decision they have to make? Put yourself in their seat. What's the decision they have to make? Is there anything I know about that could help them make that decision better? Is there any research I could do to help them make that decision better? Has that same thing been tried somewhere else with some interesting policy example? And it takes you away from the thing that you might be doing your own research on, which I think is why academics feel that the proper thing to do is not to go there, because that, after all, is not what they've been working on for 25 years. That's what other people work on. Forgetting, as I said before, that we're all part of a university, which is a place of knowledge, and we should be part of helping share that knowledge. And finding out those examples and helping the policymaker use them is really, really useful. And then finally on this, there's, for a little while I used to present in my spare time, as it were, BBC documentaries on public policy issues. And I got very frustrated because I would go to speak to the academic. I would take great care. I was bothered by the fact that the BBC always uses the same people. On any issue, they choose the same people. Right? I thought, this is ridiculous. It's just lazy. They're not going and finding the real experts. So there I was, one-woman mission. I'm going to find the real experts. Person that's worked for 30 years on this issue and get an answer from them. Disastrous. I would go to try to get an answer for them. This is for a public program. I would say to them, so in the end, should the European Union do this or not do it? Oh, I couldn't possibly answer that. And then I'd get the kind of 1-hour lecture with 15 caveats to every sentence, which is totally unusable on the radio. Right? And I would say to them, well, you've been working for 30 years on this, and the public really need an answer. So I'm not asking for your research results. I'm asking for your judgment. Right? I'm asking for your judgment as somebody steeped in the information and the data. On balance, do you think the EU should do this, or they shouldn't do this? It's amazing how uncomfortable we are as academics with that question. Well, I couldn't possibly say because it would depend upon. And it's because we're thinking of our academic colleagues, right? And during, when Britain has a radio program called the Today program, and they often ask me to comment on, particularly during the Eurozone crisis and IMF staff, and they'll ask me to comment. And every time, so I have a 30-second comment. They'll ask me a question. I have a couple of colleagues that then write to me, and they explain that I should have mentioned the following 10 caveats, and I probably should have cited their recently published paper on the issue, and they append, helpfully, their paper on the issue. And I think, I wonder when they'll work out that you don't do footnotes on radio. That's one point. And the other point is that we shouldn't just be speaking to academics defensively, that we owe the public a little more than that. And that when we're asked to comment by the media, rather than thinking, oh, this is my chance to showcase my research, we should be thinking, what do the public really need to know about this? What do the public most need to know? And is there an answer to that? Or is there not an answer to that? And why? So it's a different way of doing it. Yes?
So going back a little bit to the technology issue, you said that, technology is reshaping the labor market, and actually no one knows what's really going to happen. So what should the government do, education-wise, to prepare people to this new environment that no one knows what it's going to be like?
Yeah. So there's lots of work on that. I saw McKinsey's just did a report about Brazil and what Brazil should do. about the skills bit. So there's lots of ideas about how you start teaching people from day one about the kinds of skills they need, how you create lifelong training, how you do the skills piece. And I won't rehearse all that because I think that's all very clearly elaborated. But I think that that's only a small portion of the solution. Because the other is a huge disruption for people that are the least resilient people, that are least able to deal with the disruption. And I don't, as I said before, I don't think it's just an economic redistribution issue. I think it's a human dignity issue as well. Because they're losing not just their wage, they're losing their status, their place in the world, possibly their house, possibly the chance for their children to go to a decent school. So I don't really like the whole universal basic income idea because I don't think it does anything on the dignities. It does a little bit, but I don't know why. I haven't quite got an answer to this, and I'm uneasy with the UBI idea. But I do think that the way we should come at this is by thinking about it in the round. What do the citizens of this country need to participate as citizens? What's the minimum that they need in terms of housing, in terms of education? What's the minimum? And are we delivering that? So before we invest completely in fancy skills programs, which are only ever going to get probably about a third of people that are disrupted, I think we should come back to that issue of what is this minimum provision. And I'm not saying we should go back to 1945 and the government should do all the house building. But my challenge to the private sector is how are they going to step up to this as well? So the way I think about the private sector is that their license to operate has to change, has to become a much deeper one. And that they have to think about how they are going to help the societies in which they work remain cohesive, remain governable.
So just as a quick observation, I think these will have to be our last question because we want to get you to the airport on time.
Through the traffic-free streets of Sao Paulo.
This is the last question.
Marcelo, am I allowed to make a question?
Oh, yeah.
Come on, we'll take both questions and I'll try and be brief, which is obviously a challenge.
I'm sorry, because thank you for the invitation to be here.
No, I just wanted to touch quickly on the point of academic, the time of academic and distinction between the academic language and the timing of academia, and the time pressures of policy making and decision making in the public sector. But I wanted to provoke you in terms of what about those politicians who don't want to hear facts? And Noam Chomsky just recently published a very interesting interview in which he says the public is not interested in the truth anymore. And it's beyond the whole discussion of post-truth and post-democracy and stuff like that, but it is a part of how do we, for each of the environment or gun control in the US, how do we deal with that issue of politicians not even being interested in truth and facts, even if this is conveyed in a very simple way?
That's almost what I want to ask. I would like to hear from you. First of all, thank you for the brilliant lecture. I like it very much. I would like to hear from you about democracy. You said that in many countries, people, voters, they are voting with the majority of the population against the establishment. But sometimes it seems that they are voting against democracy. How do you deal with this question? I'm not sure about this, but when we take a look on Russia, on Turkey, even on China, it seems that democracy are going down, even in the United States.
Yeah.
Is it possible to say that in these countries, the citizen is voting against democracy?
Yeah. Thank you. Great questions, both of you. I have a really strong reaction against people saying that people don't want the truth anymore. Because we know quite a lot about how human brains work now. The last decade of cognitive psychology and neuroscience has taught us a huge amount about how the human brain works, which usually, as academics, we systematically ignore, right? So before we say humans don't want truth, I would start in a very different place and say, what is it that humans remember? Like, what is it that human beings cling to? What is it that makes sense to them? And are we working with that? So let me give an example of that. We've all seen cases where the academics or the technocrats go into a politician with 183 pages of data, right, which point to a particular policy. And they, the politician's eyes glaze over and the technocrat delivers the message. And then the politician goes outside, gets in the elevator with a political aide who says, yeah, well, that might be true, but my neighbor's child goes to a school where they do such and such, and it really seems to work. And guess what? If you go back to that politician the next day, I can promise you the only thing they remember is the neighbor's child goes to a school where they do such and such. Right? The 183 papers of data, irrelevant. So we can do one of two things. We can despair of this and say, so there's no point, we're lost, there's no point in evidence, like let's all just give up and run wonderful restaurants or something, right? No. What we need to do as rigorous, independent academics is take the 183 papers of data and the conclusion that comes from that and find the anecdote that encapsulates it so that we go armed with the anecdote that encapsulates it, right? Because if we don't do that, we're not giving the politicians a chance, we're not giving the public a chance. And yet, we don't do that because we're worried that another academic will say, that's an anecdote.
What about getting rid of elevators? That would help too.
Yeah, so walking down the stairs. So I think before, I worry about academics saying we're in a post-truth world, evidence doesn't matter, experts are disdained. I think this is our wake-up call to be better communicators, to think more about what neuroscience and psychology is telling us about how humans learn, how they remember things, which emotions get in the way of facts. Like, think about all that and incorporate it into our work. So democracy, great place to end. Are people voting against democracy? Democracy has become quite a bad word in lots of countries. And it's become associated with the three things I mentioned earlier in my lecture. It's become associated with politicians who are narcissistic and self-serving, who are corrupt, or who just act in the interest of very small cliques, and incompetence. And the revolution that's happened in Europe, in Britain, the vote against Brexit, in my own view, was not entirely about Brexit at all. It was a vote that said, the more of the establishment that line up to tell us that we must vote to remain, the more we're going to vote for Brexit. Just to show the establishment that they've got to stop telling us what to do. The most powerful slogan was take back control. That's what won the Brexit vote, take back control. For people who feel that their lives have lost control. So there's pretty good reasons why people are skeptical, in my view, of what the political class are doing. And the need for a new economic model plays into that. In Britain, people might not know really what Brexit is, or the EU is, or what it does for their community. But something that they keep telling us is they know that Google doesn't pay tax. And it really bugs them. Like, why should I, as an electrician, pay tax when Starbucks and Google and Amazon don't? Like, this, to them, it's not about Google being evil. It's about the establishment feathering its own nest. It's about the idea that there's an elite that govern entirely in the interests of the elite and think that the people are stupid. Well, the people are not going to accept that. We've seen that in every election in Europe. They will use the one weapon they have, which is their vote, to vote against that. And in doing so, but the trouble is, unless establishment politics, and this is why I argue this with passion that we need new politics and new economic model, because disenchanted with democracy as they know it, people, as they did in the 1930s, are being seduced by movements which want to destroy the institutions of democracy. So the first one we see is the rule of law. The rule of law is not convenient, right? If you're a police officer and you know that this guy keeps beating people up, and you want to go and arrest him, and you can't because you need a judge to sign off a writ that makes it possible to go and do it, it's really inconvenient. So if the government offers you to remove that inconvenience, it helps you do your job better. It has terrible consequences, because then you start getting into the police people that want to abuse that, right? It has this cascade of consequences. If you use direct democracy, we have, and I'll finish with this point. Democracy has evolved into representative democracy for a good reason, and that's that no individual citizen has the information required about who will win, who will lose, what's good for society to make most decisions. That's why we don't have direct democracy. It's because you elect a representative who you hope will represent your interests, but will also have access to the information, the advice of experts, the advice of other ministers to make the right decision for society. That's the essence of representative democracy. It means you need representation plus information and trade-offs in order to make decisions for society. So why would you ever use direct democracy? For example, in the United States, in the last presidential election, in California alone, they had 51 balloted issues, 51 referendums on different issues. A professor at Berkeley said it would have taken him 2 years full time to inform himself of those decisions, and yet people got 5 minutes, tick, 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 right? Some crazy issues. Or in Britain, the Brexit referendum. So what's going on there? I think what's going on is something very destructive of democracy, which is the politicians using referendums say that they are consulting the public. Referendums don't consult the public. They give the public a one-off shot to tick a box. That's not consultation. That is not listening to the public. Instead, what's really happening, in my view, is it's politicians absolving themselves of taking responsibility for their decisions. It's no coincidence that when politicians use a referendum, it's always on an issue that they find politically difficult for themselves. And so they want to say, oh, it's not we, the elected politicians, that made this decision, it's the people. So don't vote us out. But what, you're going to vote the people out? You can't vote the people out. So Mrs. Thatcher said in the 1980s that referendums were the tools of demagogues and dictators. And I agree with her, because they subvert representative democracy in this one important way. They make it possible for politicians not to take responsibility for decisions. And if politicians don't take responsibility for decisions, you've broken the whole point of democracy, which is that you, as a voter, can vote them out if you don't like their decision. And if they say, well, it wasn't my decision, it was the people, you've broken democracy. So I think...
So the politicians are acting against the market?
I think when they resort to referendums, I think they are. Unless, now, I rather bravely made this argument in Switzerland, which was very foolish, because it is the home of referendums.
Yes.
And they were not pleased. And it made me go away and really think about how Switzerland uses referendums. Now, this is a really important point. Switzerland is a truly consultative democracy, right? They consult every time they make even a small decision about a playground in a local community. Everybody's in on that decision. The families, the teachers, the school, the police, everybody is consulted about that decision. And they also use referendums locally. And then finally, when the government of Switzerland thinks that the referendum result is not in the national interest, they do not follow it. So when the Swiss people voted by a large majority to reject the European immigration policy, the Swiss government decided that they were wrong, it was not in the national interest, and took the other decision. That is the right thing to do. right? Because that's the problem. If the people then think that the government was wrong, they can vote them out. And that's how democracy works. Thank you all so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Pessoal do PAGP, só um segundo, a gente já vai distribuir vocês. Só acompanhar.
Well, it's a small gift from us.
Quando é que é?
Or a drone in the future.
And he said, told me they
I have a nice dinner with my son at the I will do another.
take a water for the car.
Oh, good.
Lembra que a gente virou quem quer?
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you.
Aí, posso ocupar os
Imagina, acabou agora, a gente vai só acessar o link dela e vai distribuir. Ah, é? Oi, tudo bem? Ah, legal. Pessoal, tudo bem? Gostaram aí? Depois a gente vai conversar um pouquinho. Deixa eu falar, a gente tem agora 6 salas aqui no nono andar reservadas para o encontro dos alunos com as organizações públicas que vão ser acompanhadas aí na aplicação de campo. Na porta das salas tem indicado o nome da organização, eu não sei de cor, mas são todas as salas daquele corredor do outro lado ali. São salas pequenas, tem então Fundação Casa, Secretaria Estadual de Cultura, Secretaria Municipal de Gestão, Secretaria Municipal de Inovação, Secretaria Municipal de Educação e a Associação de Saúde da Família. Então estão todas identificadas. Dentro da sala vocês vão ver também uma sugestão de pauta e eu vou estar correndo de sala em sala para... Mas sou né, são 6 salas, então uma hora eu chego em todas elas. Mas podem sair, procurar suas salas, entrarem e começarem a se apresentar e bater um papo. A ideia hoje, claro.
Só que um pouco estava discutindo a dificuldade de abordagem, que eu não sei se... eu imagino que eles têm algumas questões e que a gente vai tentar contribuir nas questões que eles já têm. E aí alguém comentou que, na verdade, algumas organizações têm questões mais claras que outras, mas a ideia é mais de ter eles...
A ideia hoje é vocês se conhecerem, as organizações poderem falar um pouco sobre quais são as questões, enfim, o momento né, de cada uma das secretarias ou da Fundação Casa, da Associação de Saúde da Família, e vocês falarem um pouco o trabalho prévio que vocês estão fazendo até agora, de conhecer um pouco os setores, análise dos problemas envolvidos, a ver se vocês estão muito ou pouco fora do alvo. Certamente vocês estão fora do alvo, e a ideia é começar a se ajustar um pouco, e aí vocês vão ter, a partir de abril até o final do ano, uma agenda de contatos aí, em que tanto as organizações vão poder ter mais clareza de onde vocês podem contribuir, como vocês vão também, nas diferentes disciplinas, poder fazer sugestões e propostas mais específicas em diferentes áreas. Então hoje a ideia é se conhecer e bater um papo, tá bom? Vocês vão ver lá uma agendinha de conversa sugerida, beleza? Valeu. Vou circulando aí nas salas, tá bom? Tá. Legal. Você vai? Maravilha. Tudo bem? Tudo bem? Claro, claro. E aí, tudo bem? Quero ver. Então, vamos... Ontem.
Então, eles só meio na saída.